This is a response to one of Thunderfoot's recent videos called Tolerance and the Ground Zero Mosque, no doubt another sequel to his saga of straw-manned criticisms of Islam. Many have already addressed some of his arguments, but I thought it necessary to add a Muslim perspective into the mix. Before going on to examine his video in detail, I will first state that I have no intention this time of responding in kind, as I have since learned from our last exchange that only non-Muslims can speak like terrorists and get away with it. With this in mind, I'll be sure to control my tone of voice and choice of words, as I don't want my completely arbitrary and obvious use of al-taqiyya to be discovered. Sarcasm intended. While Thunderfoot has recently released a clarification video in response to some of the minor criticisms to his argument, as usual refraining from addressing the larger points, his clarifications are irrelevant to my objections. However, I will pick on something he said in the info box of said clarification, and I quote, "The same was also almost universally true of the Draw Muhammad Day videos, where a very common criticism was that I did not make enough distinctions between different brands of Muslims, where in virtually all cases the distinction was explicitly made." End quote. I find this rather dishonest, if not a bit misleading. As I recall, there was only one instance in all of those videos where he made the explicit distinction between extremist Muslims and moderate Muslims, and that was when he was claiming that moderate Muslims had an alliance with extremists, while simultaneously focusing in on a poster that said, "Exterminate those who slander Islam," as seen here.
These people understand that Islam cannot withstand open scrutiny, else obviously it would have embraced the concept, and thus an alliance of convenience has been formed between the moderate weekend Muslims and the extremists who latently perceive that for their religion to survive, free speech must be either castrated or destroyed.
The heaviest criticism that he has received, and has yet to clarify, however, is that he was justifying or endorsing the idea that all Muslims would or should be exterminated for the actions of a few. Here's a clip where Thunderfoot seems to think that the appropriate reciprocation to a greater terrorist attack than 9/11 is the imposition of that which apparently all we Muslims wish to impose on the rest of the world: a Holocaust, as indicated by Thunderfoot's focus on the very word itself at the end of this clip.
If you're going to pray to Allah for anything, beg him that you never meet the giant in such a mood. For your continued existence is entirely at the discretion and goodwill of the giant, and that it is all that stands between you being granted continued existence, and you receiving yourself the self-same judgment that you would so zealously impose on the rest of the world if only you had the power. Ground Zero Mosque? Well, do they have the right? Sure, it's America, just like these guys have the right to protest at the funerals of dead soldiers. And of course people will judge them based on their actions. It's a fairly simple equation. Act like jerks and people will see you, and the organization that you purport to represent, as jerks. The general concept is, you're a jerk if you do to me what you would not like done to you. So let's take a hypothetical reciprocation example. A bunch of religious fundamentalist extremist Christians fly a couple of civilian airliners into Mecca, destroying the Kaaba, the holiest site in the Islamic world, completely. And a few years later a bunch of Christians turn up and want to build a giant Christian church and cultural centre within a proverbial stone throw of the crater, with the initial proposed name of, Crusader House. Yeah, if someone acted like this, you can easily see how this might be misinterpreted by the Islamic world as being offensive.
Ignoring the failed comparison of Muslims in general to the Westboro Baptist Church, let me just comment that simply because some people act like jerks does not necessitate that it is justified to treat others under similar labels with the same resentment, especially when said individuals disagree on the very thing you're angry about to begin with. Thunderfoot seems to be endorsing here the classic fallacy of guilt by association. Further, there are several problems with this hypothetical example. First, there is a difference between a holy site and a secular one. This seems a minor point, but I brought it up because the distinction will be relevant for the later part of this video. Perhaps a good definition of what constitutes as a holy site is the personal property of a religious establishment. Second, Thunderfoot seems to be using the same argument here that many right-wing nutjobs are using by insisting that the Park 51 Cultural Center can be interpreted as a gesture of Islamic conquest because the building was formerly named Cordoba House. For one, there is a profound difference between the Crusades and Islamic rule in Spain. The Crusades represented a time of animosity and fighting between the three Abrahamic faiths over the status and control of the Holy Land. Cordoba, Spain, the capital of Al-Andalus, represented the exact opposite. While it is true that eventually the great church of the Visigoths in the capital of Cordoba was transformed into a mosque as a symbol of Islamic rule, Muslim-ruled Spain was filled with an extraordinary amount of tolerance and solidarity that surpassed any existing civilization in that time period. It was, in fact, the prime example of pluralism for all surrounding societies to mimic. Not only this, but it was also the prime example of mathematics, architecture, science, medicine, philosophy, agriculture, literature, education, and law, all of which would paralyze Thunderfoot with awe had he lived there at the time. Anyone interested in learning more about Al-Andalus can check out a free documentary here on YouTube called When the Moors Ruled Spain. I think everyone will enjoy it. Of course, knowing Thunderfoot and many with a similar mindset, they will not give credit the religious thought at the time for any of these innovations. Rather, they will reference other external factors. This is opposed to their usual trend of giving religious thinking 100% credit when pointing to any act of terrorism. Third, even if it were true that the Muslims who wished to build a cultural center near Ground Zero wanted to let everyone know that this was an act of conquest, it would be rather counter to their claim to call it Cordoba House, seeing as the only sort of conquest that Cordoba, Spain now represents is that of Christian conquest. If you know your history, Spain was later reclaimed by Christians during the Spanish Reconquista in 1492 CE. Fourth and finally, the analogy doesn't make any sense because since the outlandish claims from right-wing nutters regarding the name Cordoba House, the Muslims who are building the cultural center here have since compromised and renamed it Park 51.
The reality is actually far worse than that. You see, it's not just that Christians wouldn't have the right to build in Mecca. All non-Muslims are prohibited, strictly prohibited, from merely entering Mecca. Yep, that's right. The very heart of the Islamic world is the apex of religious discrimination. And yes, the Islamic Saudi government gets this from the Islamic holy book, the Quran. O you who believe, the idolaters are nothing but unclean, so they shall not approach the sacred mosque after this year. Yeah, you can smell the tolerance and equality that exudes from the Islamic nation that governs the holiest site in the Muslim world according to Islamic law.
Now, first off, let me make it clear that I and the majority of Muslims do not agree with many things that Saudi Arabia does. Islamic law, or Sharia, has various interpretations which are manifested in what we call fiqh. There are four primary schools of thought that are considered orthodox: the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi, and the Hanbali. Most of those who follow these orthodox schools of thought do not agree with the way that Saudi Arabia is run. First of which because a monarchy is actually antithetical to a caliphate. So, to state that the Sauds are somehow practicing Islamic law is rather misleading, especially since they claim a very narrow perspective of the Hanbali school, the least practiced in the Muslim world, as their form of jurisprudence. Islamic states in the past, while focusing on one particular school, would still allow for various interpretations to reign depending on the circumstance and time period. Schools of thought would also change specific laws to solve new problems based on their methodologies, a process we call ijtihad. This is not the case in Saudi Arabia. That's not to say, however, that we disagree about everything. Non-Muslims are in fact not allowed near the sacred mosque or the Kaaba, but to state that this is somehow a show of intolerance towards other religions is a misinformed claim. Before getting into the technicalities as to why it is not intolerance to exclude non-Muslims from Mecca, let's put things into perspective. For one, this is just one place in the Muslim world. You are not barred from going anywhere else, including the soon-to-be-built Park 51 Cultural Center. Second, there are forms of exclusion in this world which we do not deem as intolerance, both religious and otherwise. Here are some examples. In Judaism, non-Jews and non-priests are not allowed into the Holy of Holies in their sacred temple. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, non-Christians and non-priests aren't allowed behind their sacred altar. Both the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches also technically don't allow non-Christians to take the Eucharist, or communion. And what about some non-religious forms of exclusion, like women's only health clubs and women's only bathrooms? Why are women who prefer these things not called intolerant sexist? What about immigrants needing green cards or visas to enter into certain countries? Why is this not called intolerance in the name of nationalism or patriotism? Or how about the obligation to take an oath of office to protect and uphold a government's constitution before being allowed to rule a country? Is this intolerance of other political opinions? The answer to all of these is no. Each has a specified, justified reason for excluding others, and neither are viewed as intolerant for doing so. The holy city of Mecca is reserved for Muslims because the Quran says that non-believers are unclean. There is a reason for this. Even as Muslims, we cannot even touch the Arabic version of the Quran or even pray unless we make the intention to worship and are ritualistically cleansed beforehand. This is out of respect for Allah. Now imagine these rules heightened in the most holiest place in the world to us, for which the only purpose is pilgrimage. By virtue of being a non-believer, you cannot show the same amount of respect because your intention is entirely different from our own. It is not that we think you will disrespect Mecca intentionally. It is simply lacking the necessary respect that makes it disrespectful for non-believers to go there. What person can truly respect the authority of a king if they believe the king has no authority? How can you truly respect a religion and a God in which you have no belief in? Mecca is not a tourist attraction. It's Islam's personal property. So if you want to take a seat in Islam's Oval Office, you're going to have to take an oath to uphold the constitution of our religion and all that it stands for. We call that oath the Shahada, which goes something like this: There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. So, not allowing you into Mecca is not intolerance. True intolerance comes from those who demand that we allow them to impose their lack of respect onto our most holy site. Now that I think that that's been clarified, I think a question needs to be asked of Thunderfoot, one that he has failed to address in just about every video he's made on Islam. This time, we'll use the help of one of his fellow atheists.
If you believe that an Islamic center close to the World Trade Center is disrespectful and insensitive to the families of 9/11, then please answer the question that no one at the protest could answer. What do the 9/11 terrorists have to do with the people who live around here, some of whom also lost family members inside the World Trade Center? And if your only answer is Islam, therefore ignoring the many different sects of the religion and the intensity and harshness of some of its adherents in contrast with more laid-back followers, that I can just as easily turn this around on any group with the same logic.
Of course, Thunderfoot's response is of no surprise. Claim without any evidence that Saudi Arabia's mainstream Islam, meaning that is the majority belief among Muslims, all the while mentioning that most of the 9/11 hijackers are a product of such belief.
Indeed, Saudi Arabia is maybe an archetypal example of what Islam has to offer. It's a mainstream Islamic country governed by Muslims who believe in the application of Sharia. I should mention that Saudi Arabia also fielded 15 out of the 19 9/11 hijackers. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for the productive enrichment of society through cultural mixing. It's just that mainstream Islam, as practiced in the holiest sites in the heart of the Muslim world, is antithetical to that exact concept.
Of course, this is all complete nonsense, as Saudi Arabia is nowhere close to an archetypal example of Islam, as I pointed out earlier on. In fact, many Muslims have attempted to fight against Saudi Arabia since its establishment. For instance, several attempts have been made to overthrow the government from within, but Saudi security forces have countered them each time. And do you know which allies aided them in these countermeasures? That's right, France and the United States. So excuse the rest of the Muslim world for not being able to get rid of such a hostile regime. Many of us have attempted to in the past, but it seems, as Thunderfoot likes to say, that some of those in the age of reason have an alliance of convenience with extremists, and they latently perceive that for their national interest to survive, justice and reform must either be castrated or destroyed. Finally, we come to the last part of his video.
I'll be blunt. I will not be lectured on the virtues of tolerance or accept bargaining chips labelled "in the name of tolerance" from someone who, in order to comply with their religion, gets down on their knees 5 times a day to pray to an icon of discrimination.
Maybe you, Thunderfoot, would like to tell that to those Muslims in the United States and Europe who have been fearing for their lives since 9/11. Or perhaps maybe these aren't worthy enough targets for your animosity. Perhaps Ahmed Sharif is, a New York taxi driver who was recently stabbed almost to death just because he answered in the affirmative when his attacker asked him if he was Muslim. Or maybe even he is not good enough to parade on camera for the sake of your spite. Perhaps the thousands of innocent Iraqi men, women, and children whom you used to zealously defend against the illegal occupation by foreign superpowers, perhaps they are worthy enough of your condemnation, all because they pray in the direction to something in which you have little understanding of, and no wish to understand. Perhaps you will not be lectured about the virtues of tolerance by any of these human beings, but maybe that's because they shouldn't have to lecture you.